Okay, all right. The author of more than 10 books, Riley Black has been called one of our premier gifted young science writers. Her books include Skeleton Keys, My Beloved Brontosaurus, Deep Time, and most recently, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs. She's also written for an array of publications, including National Geographic, Scientific American, Slate, New Scientist, and many others. And she's appeared in documentaries such as Nova's Alaskan Dinosaurs and Dinosaur Apocalypse. When not writing about fossils, Riley regularly volunteers with museum and university field crews on expeditions throughout Utah and the Southwest. Take it away, Riley.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Carrie, and thank you so much, Jean, for asking me to come and speak to you all. I always love when I have a new book out, and I get to do a little something for our local UFOP chapter, and it makes me happy to see so many of you. I'm sorry that we can't be, here all in person, but in a sense, let's more people join in on this. So what I'm planning on doing tonight is not so much like a standard lecture. I've got a little slideshow with some of the art from the book, and I'm going to take you through sort of what transpires in the book. What is it about the KPG mass extinction that fascinates us so much? Why do we keep coming back to this particular event? What does it mean to us? And then I'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussion and conversation afterwards, because that's the fun part, because we all have our own ideas and images of this event that we grew up with, and seeing how much has changed, especially in the past few years. That's really what allowed me to write this book the way that I did, was because when I was growing up, it was often a matter of, like the impact winter might have killed the non-avian dinosaurs, and be all these images of an emaciated T-Rex out in this ash field somewhere collapsing. Or, we'd hear about the debates going on. Was it the impact? Was it volcanic eruptions in the area of the Deccan Traps? Was it something else? And especially in the past about 5 years, and even in the past year, there's been so many different finds from so many different places that really lets us narrow down on some of these major events. So if you haven't read the book yet, you can find it just about anywhere. And the way it's organized is starting from the day before the impact in the ancient Yucatan, what created the Chicxulub crater. It takes you through the second, the hour, the day, the week, the month, the year, the decade, all the way up through 1 million years, at about that time frame. Talk about if you were there, what would you see? What are the organisms doing? How are they responding to the environmental changes? So there are plenty of books already. Many of you have probably read books like T-Rex and the Crater of Doom or Night Comes to the Cretaceous that really cover the scientific debates and sort of how these ideas came about and who's arguing with whom. But this is really distilling this knowledge and trying to put you there. So with that, also hello, Jet, good to see you. Maybe Strato will also make an appearance. Let me get my slideshow kind of ready if I can. And for some reason, it's not showing me that one. I guess I'll have to do the entire screen, and we'll give that a try.
Bertha, does he need to? Oh, there it comes. Yes, excellent. Okay.
Yes. So yeah, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at the handle Laylaps, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'll take it from here. So this is a close-up. I love the bylighting on this particular image of Sue. This is a cast of Sue the T-Rex that was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, our traveling exhibit. And when we think about the fossil record, when we think about the end of the Cretaceous, it's often things like this. We often think about that great dinosaur find that we all want to make, and what were dinosaurs doing during that last part of the Mesozoic. We obviously know that it wasn't the end of the dinosaur story, that dinosaurs are still with us. We certainly still have plenty of birds around. They're doing very, very well. But when we think of dinosaurs, we think of things like this. We think about the ferocity. We think about how they lived and what they were doing and who was eating whom. And sometimes it's quite difficult. There's, particularly when you come up to the KPG boundary, there's what's called the, I think it's the 2-meter problem, or generally about 6 feet below that boundary. It's very, very difficult to find vertebrate fossil remains. Of course, there's the Tana site, which is its own sort of thing. We're still learning about that, and sort of as peer-reviewed research is coming out and what that represents. But in general, it's hard to get those images, and yet we know those animals were there. We have enough scraps, we have enough bits and pieces, and particularly in the Western United States, it was kind of amazing to me. I really wanted to feature this a little bit more. There's a section in the book where I talk about a little Allosaurus hatchling that's developing because we had that dinosaur, this big sauropod, one of the largest ones to have ever existed in ancient Utah, in what's called the North Horn Formation. And the North Horn Formation, if you can find the right spots, you can see, basically equivalent to the Hell Creek Formation and the overlying Paleocene Formation. You can track who's appearing, who's disappearing through that boundary. You have those before and after snapshots. They're just very hard to get to. You have to drive quite a long ways to get to some of these exposures, and there'll be an exposure that's maybe about the size of this room before you have to drive for another hour or two to get to the next one. So there are places, this is why people go to Montana and the Dakotas most often. It's to get access to fossils that let us envision sites like this and all these interactions. And this is really what we love to do, is that we like to go from things like this, basically the fossils that we have, the remnants of these ancient creatures, whether it's bones or tracks or geochemical traces or whatever it is, and envision what were they doing in life. And this is often clothed in very technical language. It's often presented very much in terms of, what can we accurately say, what arguments can we support. But I think all of us, to some degree, we're curious. We want to know. We want to know what these animals look like, how they sounded, how they behaved, how they responded to their environment, how they interacted with each other. So this is kind of my chance, I guess, writing this book, was to this is my version of what I think the Mesozoic world is, steeped in science, but filling in some of those gaps. I mentioned this in the appendix. The book is organized in such a way that it tells the story of the impact and what happened in the following million years. But there's also an appendix where I try and lay out, this is why I'm saying what I'm saying in this book. This is what's based on science. This is what's based on this particular research or this particular paper. And this is something that's speculation, or this is me filling in the blanks. And the reason I'm doing that, and the reason that I tried to be so sort of upfront about it, was there's this book that came out in the late 19th century called The World Before the Deluge. And there's a picture in it of a Jurassic forest, of sort of Morrison Formation type habitat with all these towering conifers. And there's an Archaeopteryx in the air. And the Archaeopteryx has its wings out and it's fully feathered, and it has no head. And at the time the illustrator was creating this image, paleontologists hadn't yet recognized that we'd found the skull of Archaeopteryx. It was actually confused for a set of fish jaws that were on the same slab of limestone. But the artists, when they were making this particular depiction, they didn't, I guess, want to go out on a limb, because nobody really knew, did this bird have teeth? Did it have a beak? What did its head look like? And yet, that's kind of silly. You're envisioning this entire scene, and yet you're kind of pulling back when we know, obviously this is a bird. Bird is a vertebrate. It has a skull. It's a gnathostomy. It has jaws. It has a central nervous system. It has soft tissues. It has all these things. So in trying to hew so closely to accuracy, it actually kind of becomes inaccurate when we know that there are things, obviously, that we may never be able to know, or may never be able to fill in. And yeah, it'd be kind of like presenting or envisioning, late Cretaceous dinosaurs like T-Rex or Triceratops as just kind of like piles of bones walking around without the relevant soft tissues that we knew that they obviously had. So all of this goes into that process of imagining what this was like. So I work closely with an illustrator who's a friend of mine named Quarry, who did some really fantastic illustrations for this. All the rest of the illustrations in the presentation, with the exception of the photos towards the end, are by her. So this is my version of the T-Rex that's in the book. I wanted a fluffy T-Rex, and I wanted to imagine an animal that was about 30 feet long and not entirely fully grown. We know from research of dinosaur growth histories and the many specimens of T-Rex in particular that have been uncovered, that these dinosaurs have this very interesting sort of S-shaped growth curve, where they're starting off very, very small, very gracile, very leggy. They kind of look awkward. They look like awkward little chicken things. And they go through this teenage growth spurt that's absolutely phenomenal. and they start reaching sexual maturity and start reproducing before they reach skeletal maturity, so that they basically become adults before they entirely stop growing. So I felt like in many aspects of paleontology and paleo art, we're often focused on the biggest or the most exceptional. And it would have been very easy to be, like this is a 40-foot long, monstrous T-Rex that's, absolutely ferocious. And I wanted to do something a little bit different and envision this scene of this T-Rex kind of sniffing out this Triceratops carcass and basing it upon what I witnessed once in Yellowstone, like taking cues from our modern environment about interactions that must have taken place, even if we don't have direct evidence of those things all the time. So a number of years ago, I think it was the summer of 2017, I was visiting Yellowstone National Park. And if you go out there, one of the areas where you can see wolves relatively regularly is the Hayden Valley. And out in the Hayden Valley, a bison had died relatively close to the road. This was like an old lone male bison. And all the rangers were putting up the tape and everything else. People were starting to gather because the carnivores are going to show up sooner or later. There are actually all these birds, all these ravens, golden eagles, all these birds that were kind of hanging around waiting because they couldn't open up that carcass, that their beaks and stuff were not strong enough. They could nip at the nose or at the eyes or what have you, but they couldn't get all that good stuff inside. They needed to wait for something bigger. And it was just about nightfall watching this that the grizzly bear came out from the forest on the other side of the valley and just made a beeline for that bison carcass. And by then it was dark and it was time to go home. But first thing in the morning, I came back and this grizzly bear and this gray wolf were just basically taking turns feeding on this carcass. And in between, all these birds were feeding on what scraps they could gather. And I realized that, if a bison hide is that tough, imagine what the scaly hide of a Triceratops might have been like. And during that time in the Hell Creek ecosystem, you had all these birds and all these pterosaurs and all these things that would want a piece of basically that Triceratops body, but they can't access what's inside. They need something bigger to open it up. In this case, in that ecosystem, that would be a T-Rex. So that was something that, do we have evidence of an interaction like this happening in the past? Not exactly. We've got T-Rex bite marks on Triceratops skulls and Triceratops bones. We know that they both hunted and scavenged. But it was really extrapolating from things that I saw in the modern world and being, okay, what's the prehistoric equivalent of this? Were these interactions happening in the past? Are some of these niches and interactions between predator and prey or scavenger and what they're eating, are they actually incredibly ancient? And that inspired a lot of the scene setting for this. So that's kind of where we start the story. And it's the day before impact, the sort of the height of the dinosaurian apex. And I use that phrase because there's been some debate in recent years about whether dinosaur diversity was declining at the end of the Cretaceous. And some of the data says yes, some of the data says no. But the thing that we need to remember is that we are dealing with a very incomplete fossil record, in that we are already starting with only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of all the creatures that have ever lived, all the organisms that have ever lived, being preserved as fossils, being buried in such a way that they're sort of protected by those rock layers, that those rock layers are later, through tectonic forces or orogenies, brought up back to the surface, that people are in the right place at the right time to find those fossils. So it's really kind of amazing that we know as much as we do, because the statistics are kind of against it. And when you look at this in terms of the end Cretaceous, and you look at the dinosaurs that are around, particularly in North America, we can look at, for example, the diversity in our Kuiperowitz formation and say, okay, there are a lot more dinosaur species around at this time, and 10 million years later, there aren't as much. There are some biological things going on, but the fact of the matter also is that 75 million years ago, we had that lovely Western Interior Seaway that created all these floodplains, all these places where those dinosaurs could be buried and preserved as fossils. That's why we have wonderful fossils from Dinosaur Park and from our Kuiperowitz formation, places in New Mexico. And we get that latitudinal gradient that we're always wondering why that's in place. By the Maastrichtian, by the end of the Cretaceous, the Western Interior Seaway is mostly gone. There was actually a paper about this that came out in PNAS a couple of years ago, saying basically the amount of exposure that we have is so much less, and it covers so much less of the continent, that there are probably entire communities of dinosaurs that existed in places, particularly to the south of us, particularly in places like Texas and New Mexico and elsewhere, that we just have no idea about because the rocks aren't there. or they're not as accessible. So that all plays into this idea. So I'm really coming from a standpoint of like, dinosaurs are still doing great, that this is really an unprecedented event in so many different ways. And a lot of what I wanted to dig into was the interactions between organisms. An early reader of the book said, your dinosaurs are gross. They throw up and they poop and they've got lice and they've got infections and they break bones. And I think that's important to remember, because so often when we envision these animals, we envision them as kind of pristine. We envision them as like without injury, when, even watching wildlife today, you'll notice injuries, you'll notice diseases, you'll notice animals that die of one cause or another, by drought or by some sort of infection or whatever it is. So in our second chapter, I had Quarry draw this version of an Edmontosaurus trying to do those little hoofs on the front feet that some recent finds suggest. But basically it has like lice, because we know that lice, especially like feather lice or lice that kind of live in scales, existed during the Mesozoic. There's a paper that actually looks at the genetics of this, where we don't always have the fossils. But if you look at the genetic history of feather lice in particular, they go through a mass extinction during the KPG, that they're actually doing very well and living on the various birds and dinosaurs and mammals that were around. And that mass extinction took away most of their food source. So I felt it was so important not just to focus on the big charismatic animals, but also zoom in and say, okay, what are these interactions? Because we often think about species, even fossil species, as these discrete boxes, sort of the boundaries of where one starts and the other ends, and we'll debate about who's synonymized with what and all that wonderful stuff. But the fact is that every animal, every dinosaur was an ecosystem by itself. That an herbivore like Edmontosaurus, okay, that is a species, but it also relies on bacteria in its gut that can break down plant cell walls, because animals can't make that for themselves. So symbiosis is part of what defines this animal. And this animal must have had parasites or other things that ate it, and all these interactions that form part of what it is as a species. So this is really a paleoecological book. This is a book about those interactions and how they changed. And it's really a matter of, like, it was just fantastic to try and imagine this. Like, how would dinosaurs react to the world that they were in and some of the changes that must have happened? I've heard a lot of people comment about a particular chapter starring Ankylosaurus, that basically the moments directly after impact. And we know from some recent finds that basically the seismic activity, that basically the earthquakes and things that must have happened following impact transpired very, very quickly within about the first hour, and what it must have been like to be in the Hell Creek ecosystem. And just all of a sudden everything starts shaking, and it continues to shake, and you start to have all these changes beginning to happen as the sky starts to seem a little bit darker, and you have all this debris that was thrown up into the air by the impact start to come back down. And that's really the critical part. So I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation how when I was young, when I was a girl, it was a matter of like watching these dinosaurs slowly kind of like erode away. It's this form of like attrition during the impact winter. From what we understand now, the picture is very, very different. That non-avian dinosaurs probably, for the most part, did not make it through the first day, or the first 24 hours. There's a great paper called Survival in the First Hours of the Cenozoic that really, it's a review paper, but really pulls together a lot of these emergent threads of evidence. And when you think about just the millions of cubic miles of rock that were thrown up into the air, into the atmosphere by the impact. So basically we're dealing with numbers that they sound like children's numbers. They sound made up. They are so extreme that it's very difficult to get your head around the speed of that bolide and how fast the earth was moving and all the debris that was thrown up into the atmosphere and all these things basically interlocking and reinforcing each other, making the system play out the way that it did. But think about just all that debris, just like a ton of all this debris going up into the air and starting to come back down. Now, if you've ever seen a science fiction movie, you've probably seen some kind of spacecraft or shuttle re-entering an atmosphere, and it lights up because of the friction. Basically, there's no air in space, and as it starts to hit an atmosphere in which there is air, there's friction that builds up as that object re-enters the atmosphere. So imagine that with lots of tiny bits of glass, lots of tiny bits of rock, and any particular one doesn't really make a difference. But altogether, all of that friction creates an infrared pulse. So basically, it creates an incredible amount of heat. It raises the temperature of the air all over the planet to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you've ever broiled a chicken, that's pretty much what the air was like at the time. It was so hot that some models predict that dry forest litter would have spontaneously basically caught on fire, that you would have had spontaneous forest fires erupting because the air is just so hot. And the non-avian dinosaurs, I'm sorry to say, probably wouldn't have even made it that far. There's no way to, unless you're an extremophile bacteria, there is no way to handle this. And when we look at the pattern of extinction and who survives as well, we were confounded by this as scientists for a number of years, but starting to make much more sense that if you had this infrared pulse, if you couldn't get underground or if you couldn't get underwater, there was simply no place to go. So if you're an animal like an Ankylosaurus or a T-Rex, or really anything large, there simply is no escape from something like this. But if you could get underground, or if you could get underwater, we know from studies of modern forest fires that there are forest fires that have happened and recorded as being about as hot as this infrared pulse got, but it only takes maybe about 3 inches of soil for those effects to start to be mitigated. That basically the soil can shield animals that were underground. So if you were a mammal that had a burrow, or if you were a turtle that could go into the bottom of a pond, this kind of explains why some of these creatures that we often think of as on the margins, or kind of the window dressing for the Cretaceous world, did so well, whereas the larger animals, the more charismatic animals, didn't. And this, of course, involves lots of other forms of life that we had fantastic pterosaurs at the time. Quetzalcoatlus was about the size of a giraffe, and yet it flew. And we had, filter-feeding plesiosaurs that lived around Antarctica. And I try and pull out at the end of each chapter and really talk about what's going on around the rest of the planet. How are all these other forms of life being affected? So even though the book is called The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, and even though the dinosaurs are certainly the focus of the story, this really involves so many other forms of life on Earth. The estimate is, I think, currently stands at about 75% of known species went extinct during this event. So this really was something that was incredibly dramatic, incredibly unprecedented, and it's something that's unlike any other mass extinction that we know of. When you look at all the other mass extinctions that happened prior, and there's been recent studies suggesting that maybe there are more mass extinctions in the fossil record than we presently recognize. But if we talk just about the big five, the 5 classic ones, all of the previous 4 prior to the Cretaceous, they were caused by very terrestrial sort of mechanisms. They had intense volcanic activity that created a lot of global warming and lowered oxygen levels in the atmosphere. Or you had, sort of these oxygen crises in the ocean. All these different things that we're still unpacking and trying to understand. But the end Cretaceous extinction is the only one, despite people looking for, an asteroid impact for these other extinctions, it's the only one that was caused by an impact like this. And it really was the worst case scenario, because there are also other impact craters, like the Papagai crater in Siberia from an impact that if I remember correctly, occurred during the Eocene, that's not tied to a mass extinction. So it's not just that a big rock hit the planet and a mass extinction happened. It's that this happened in the absolute worst way at every single step. And that's kind of wild to think about, because it's not as if the asteroid was hanging out near Earth. It's not like it was just hanging out with the moon and decided to pay us a visit on the worst possible day. This was something that, so far as we understand, likely was part of basically rock from the formation of our own solar system that was not taken up into a planet or other sort of body in our solar system. A kind of asteroid that's called the carbonaceous chondrite. And it might have belonged to part of what's called the Oort cloud. It's kind of this cloud of debris and asteroids and other pieces of rock around the edge of our solar system that it got pulled inwards. And as it got pulled inwards, it kind of, gets pulled towards the sun, Jupiter, and the gravity there is strong enough to kind of get snapped and sent towards Earth. And this is transpiring over hundreds of millions of years. So when you think about it, the fate of the non-avian dinosaurs was more or less sealed before they even evolved, and they obviously could have no idea of this. That this, basically, the asteroid that was set to hit the Earth was traveling towards them through the entire rise and proliferation of the non-avian dinosaurs. And it's just so strange to think about. This is interplanetary geology, basically. This is not, it was a freak accident at the time. But this is part of what living in our universe involves, that geology is not just what's about on our planet, it's also about what's going on in the rest of our solar system, the rest of our galaxy, the rest of our universe. So part of what I wanted to focus on is like what allowed the survivors to survive? How did they make it through? And when we think about, sort of the groups that do pretty well through all this, mammals obviously come up. So I really wanted Quarry in particular to draw an image. This is a multi-tuberculate. So it's kind of like a Mesozoic equivalent of a squirrel. And multis, they don't get enough appreciation. I think they're probably one of the most successful, if not the most successful group of mammals as it's ever been. They, evolved sometime during the Jurassic. They survived until the Oligocene. So basically, like hundreds of millions of years, they were around. And if this mass extinction had not happened and significantly weakened their diversity, they may not have been replaced by rodents. We might still have multi-tuberculates around us now because we know they made it through. And we know some of them likely lived or used burrows, and that they're able to survive by gnawing dinosaur bones. We actually have some dinosaur bones that have distinctive tooth marks created by these kinds of mammals. So this is what really allowed survival to occur, or these animals to make it through, was because they had particular adaptations. They had particular ways of living that were conducive to this churned up, chaotic world that the impact created. And part of this is also thinking about, well, what happened to the fossil record? Sites like Tanis aside, we don't have a great fossil record from this impact. You would think that something that is this dramatic and has happened globally, we would find dinosaur bones like everywhere within the boundary, and we don't. And there are some aspects of what came after that heat pulse, which died down probably within about 24 to 48 hours or so, once the impact winter started to set in, that modified the fossil record. It's expected that all these sulfur compounds that were in the limestone that the asteroid struck, so basically the remains of these ancient reefs that were so ancient that they're actually fossils by the time the asteroid struck. They're full of these sulfur compounds that went up into the air, and we know not only are those compounds really, really good at reflecting back sunlight and reducing photosynthesis, because we've observed this during human history, but also they can basically be incorporated into acid rain. And there's a great paper that I found some inspiration from about acid rain and these little crustaceans called ostracods that are often used as paleoenvironmental markers. So, even though this is a book very much about vertebrates, and that's what I love to write about, it's a lot of invert stuff that sometimes gives us this background. And that paper in particular was suggesting that the acid rain that likely occurred during the early parts of the impact winter have all these compounds that's feeding this acid rain. Not so much that it would like sting your skin, but it's enough that it starts to break down calcium carbonate. It starts to break down the kind of stuff that bones and shells are made out of, that it may have somewhat erased some of the fossil record. So if you have bones on the surface or exposed, kind of like this, Triceratops skull that Quarry drew, that they would have been eroded or even destroyed by some of this, and it kind of reduced the fossil record that might otherwise be there. And through all of this, we have some things that stood out as conundrums, things that we're only now starting to understand. So prior to impact, you had three groups of very similar dinosaurs that coexisted with each other. You had raptors that were very feathery and they had teeth and they were carnivores. You had toothed birds that fed on lizards and insects and things like that, that were very raptor-like, because obviously they're closely related to those dinosaurs. And you had beaked birds that ate seeds and nuts and vegetation, and obviously were very different from those other two groups. But we know, obviously, that the only dinosaurs that survived, the only birds that survived, are the beaked ones. So why did that happen? What made the difference? There's a paper that came out of a group in, I think it was Toronto, so a group of paleontologists that said, well, those teeth are probably the answer, that if you are a carnivorous feathery dinosaur, even if you're small, even if you're very bird-like, even if you're able to hide in a burrow and kind of make it through that first infrared pulse, that there's not a lot to eat on the other side of this, that your food sources, whether they're small lizards, small mammals, other things, they've been severely reduced, and you probably can't find that food anymore. But beaked birds for millions of years had already been adapted to eating seeds and nuts and breaking down these things that would have been kept safe in the soil, basically the seed bank that exists that plants build up just through their existence. And likely that's what allowed beaked birds to make it through. Whereas if the extinction had played out in a slightly different way, and there had been more food for the insectivores and the small carnivores, that we might still have raptor-like dinosaurs running around rather than beaked birds basically carrying the banner for all dinosaurs through. And these are things that we've only recently started to come and understand and realize, where sometimes extinction survival, it didn't play out the same for everybody. And there are certainly some extinctions that happen for causes that had very little to do with the impact. For example, if you're a little marine bivalve and you're happy as a clam living in the remnants of the Western Interior Seaway and that ocean disappears, well, obviously you're going to go extinct because you have no habitat left. But the main story, the main thing that's driving this mass extinction, not just the turnover of species that's constantly happening, is the asteroid impact. And it was very difficult for animals that even made it through. So we have no ammonites anymore, which always bums me out, because we have chambered nautilus, which are super cool. And we have things like brachiopods and crinoids, which are very, very ancient, and they made it through and they still live in our oceans. But we don't have living ammonites. And the fossil record suggests that ammonites made it through for about 100,000 years after impact, and they still went extinct. So they survived the worst of it. They survived the infrared pulse, they survived the 3 years of impact winter, and they still went extinct. And that might be because ocean ecosystems collapsed so fundamentally that they're more or less eating their own offspring. We don't know for sure why ammonites entirely went extinct, but they're living in the ocean. They were shielded from a lot of these effects. But that breakdown of photosynthesis, basically, photosynthesis is the basis for ecosystems on our planet, particularly in the oceans. And we can track this through these little things called coccoliths, these little discs that are basically like a kind of algae. And prior to the extinction, you have some coccoliths that photosynthesize, you have some that can photosynthesize and eat organic matter and kind of be these little scavenger type things. And after impact, you only find the scavenger type ones, at least for a little while. And what that suggests is that photosynthesis more or less stopped in the oceans. And that's like pulling the rug out from under the entire food web. So when that happens, you can't build on that. There's not much left to eat. So if you're something like an ammonite that reproduces with very, very small offspring, but you also eat plankton, it's possible that they were eating their own offspring, basically that they ate themselves into extinction because there was nothing else to survive on, and ecosystems did not recover fast enough for them to find other sources of food. Whereas chambered nautilus are doing something different. They found some other food source and their offspring were too big and they didn't eat that particular kind of food, so they were not under that same kind of pressure. And I love some of the changes that we've started to learn about that transpired basically in the wake of this impact, things that we see mammals start to diversify and proliferate and evolve in new ways. And we can follow this not just through the bones, but also through things that we can observe in living animals. There's a paper that I drew from for this book about basically enzymes that break down chitinase, or chitinase as the enzyme that breaks down chitin. So basically what insect shells are made out of. And if you look at the genetic history of this, that Mesozoic mammals or mammals that existed in the early part of the Cenozoic, they had multiple copies of this chitinase gene, like as many as 5. So basically, they were really good at eating and breaking down insect shells. And that was likely an important part of their diet. So that's why I had this little kind of very generalized Mesonechid, one of these carnivorous mammals that at the time was a little bit more of an omnivore, kind of looking at this beetle, like trying to decide whether to eat it or not, because insects were probably a very important part of the mammal diet. And it was only as mammals started to diversify and spread out that they start to lose those copies of those genes, and they're not as good anymore at digesting insects because they're basically plowing new niches. They're finding new ways to exist. And this happens kind of surprisingly fast. There are some really fantastic studies coming out of the Coral Bluffs area, basically the Denver Basin. And these are fossils that we've known about for a little while, but it's the recent discoveries that you might have seen published on. There was a Nova documentary about this as well, and there's an exhibit at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science that you get a snapshot of 100,000 years after impact and also 1 million years after impact. And by 1 million years after impact, you have mammals that are about the size of a German Shepherd. And that's pretty significant because before impact, the largest mammals were about the size of a house cat. So even though 1,000,000 years is a long time, like even just counting to 1,000,000, it takes a while to do. I don't want to sort of minimize how long in absolute terms that is, but in relative terms, that's pretty quick that you start to have forests come back, and they're coming back in new and different ways because you don't have big dinosaurs tromping through everything. So in the Mesozoic world, a forest would probably look something like an East African savanna or woodland, where you have patches of trees, but you have a lot of sort of relatively open areas because the dinosaurs are keeping that open based upon where they walk or what trees they push over or what they eat. Whereas there aren't any big animals anymore in the early Paleocene world. So forests can grow a lot denser. And when you get a dense forest, you get a lot more habitat basically per square acre. So all of a sudden you have a canopy that is its own habitat. And you see tree trunks that are connected to each other. They're their own habitats, and the surface of the soil and even underground. So you have this crucible from mammalian evolution for mammals to start doing new and different interesting things. And we're starting to learn more about them. In that there's a study that came out just a couple of months ago saying that if you look at the brains of early Paleocene mammals, and there's actually a good example of this on the next slide. So this is a model of Eoconodon, that animal I just showed you on the last slide, as well as one of the skulls from the Corral Bluffs area. You're looking at the underside of it there on the right side of the screen, and you can see how thin that middle portion is, how much space is devoted to basically jaw closing musculature, and how small basically the brain case is compared to the rest. And what we're learning about early Paleocene mammals is their body size is getting bigger, but their brains are not getting bigger along with their bodies. That these are two separate things. So it's not proportional as they get larger. So you have a German Shepherd sized animal with the brain about the size of a house cat. And it was only about another 15 million years later, during the Eocene, that you start to see mammals getting these new behaviors and acting in more complex ways. So this was, somebody asked me when I was giving one of these talks about recovery. When did these ecosystems recover? It's difficult to say because we can't go back to what the Mesozoic was. There's not a second age of reptiles that's kind of on the way, that life is very different now. But I would say by the 1,000,000-year mark, you at least have the preconditions where like the world is starting to fill up again, that you're starting to see like more evolution and more diversification than you are seeing extinction. And that's really the turning point. And this directly involves us. This is my last slide. This is a little critter. We don't know exactly what it looks like, but you may be familiar with it. Its name is Purgatorius. So it is the earliest known primate. Paleontologists think it looks something like a tree shrew. And the thing that still gets me is that Purgatorius was around at the same time as T-Rex and Triceratops. That the story of primates, the story of our family, didn't come after impact. It actually started before the impact. So this isn't just a matter of non-avian dinosaurs would have still held onto the planet and modified ecosystems if the mass extinction never occurred. That's certainly true. We wouldn't be here if the mass extinction never happened. But that our own ancestry, our own story is directly entwined with this event, not with just some speculative kind of mammalian ancestor, but that the very first primates that we know of were present for this mass extinction. And they found a way to make it through. And that is part of this legacy of resilience that basically our ancestors could have just as easily bid it with the non-avian dinosaurs during this mass extinction. And yet they didn't. And that we are part of the story and that we have a direct connection to it and our own history. So with that, I'm going to end the slideshow and stop my screen sharing. Thank you so much for sitting through that. And I am happy to take questions.
Okay, so we do just one comment, a couple of comments that I found in the chat. And thank you, Riley. And by the way, definitely wonderful hearing that recap. I mean, I've already started in on some of the detail of the book, and it amazes me, some of the evolutionary development things that go in. But anyway, so Robert Peterson did point out that if you do want to watch The Prehistoric Planet, that Apple does have a 7-day free trial, so you can get it in within the 7 days. Also, Jimena Diaz says, Riley, congratulations for the incredible work. I started reading the book yesterday, it is incredible how many details it has and how many references are included in the notes to support the narrative. So
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
wonderful.
And Robert, you said, and they got sick. I think that was somewhere around when he was talking about the lice.
Okay, just for the record, real quick, my pronouns are she, her, not he, him.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I do that? I thought I was talking about, sorry about that.
Yeah, I was talking about when you were talking about, how they're like us and what they went through. I was just adding that, and they got sick like us.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that's the great thing about paleopathologies, right? Is that we know that these dinosaurs, they had to deal with a lot of the same things that we do, because there are so many things that are just common to vertebrates in general. Like there are things like we have evidence of tooth infections and stuff that go all the way back to the Permian and probably existed even earlier. So it's fascinating to look at just sort of how many things just kind of come with being a vertebrate, and the risks that coming with being an animal or belonging to a particular group, and how ancient many of these things are. I think I mentioned this at the very beginning of the book, but I have the bull triceratops that dies at the very beginning, die of a malignant tumor, and we know that ceratopsid dinosaurs had to deal with this. There's a Cenozoic bone that has a malignant tumor in it that was found in the Dinosaur Park area. And yeah, that this is something that goes back over 75 million years. It's just part of having a skeleton. It's part of being an animal.
Yes.
And Elaine Jones is asking, how can we get a signed copy of your book?
Yeah, so I am going to drop a link in the chat. So I think there are a few copies if you're in the Salt Lake City area at Weller Books that you can still grab. And if you see me around the museum or somewhere, you can always ask me. But otherwise, so this is what I just dropped in the chat was a link to a form.
Okay.
And you can just fill that out. I know it says May 3rd on it. You can ignore that. I closed it temporarily, but I'm opening it for you all. So this will basically just give me your name and who you want to sign it to and where to send it to. You can get a free book plate. So that's something that I can show you what it looks like real quick. So it's a little thing that I can sign, and you can just stick it right into the front of your book. So that's probably the easiest way.
I like that.
So this would also be if someone wanted a signed copy, but they live out of state, could they still get a signed copy shipped to them?
So I don't send out a signed copy like written in the book itself. The easiest way would probably be to do the book plates via that Google Forms link.
Oh, okay, because I was thinking of having a signed copy shipped to me, and especially from after watching your documentary. And I do remember us meeting when we were asking questions for Wynn's class.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the book place is probably the easiest way to do that. Otherwise, you can send me an email through my website. I can leave this on here, and we can work some way to get you that copy.
I appreciate that.
And Susan Bednarchik, sorry if I mispronounced that, says, great presentation. Thank you, Riley. And John Foley says, great discussion. Thank you. Can you expand a little bit about the mammalian radiation that happened? How did we get to mice and whales so fast?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're still learning a bit about like how this occurred, basically what we call the age of mammals. Like part of it is that those niches were open now. They're kind of vacated, and mammals during their time during the Mesozoic, basically reproducing at small size, reproducing relatively quickly, and possibly with larger litters. We don't know this for sure, but it's something that maybe the conditions of living sort of in the shadow of the non-avian dinosaurs allowed them to reproduce more quickly, because this is a strategy that we know worked for archosaurs, for dinosaurs and other reptiles. In the early Triassic, is in a sense they filled up the ecosystem because they reproduced faster. And I mentioned this a little bit in the book, that we could have had a second age of reptiles. So we certainly had crocodiles around, and turtles and birds and things like that. So why didn't that happen? And it may have been that mammals were just able to fill up the ecosystems that much more quickly. And even though these things are relatively fast, have the first whales that are about 55 million years old or so, it's still relatively slow compared to what reptiles did, like in the wake of previous mass extinctions. Basically after the Triassic Jurassic mass extinction, after the Permian Triassic mass extinction, reptiles like really ran with those open niches. There's a paper about an ichthyosaur that was recently found in Nevada called Symbospondylus youngorum. It basically was a giant ichthyosaur. It's an ichthyosaur about the size of a humpback whale that existed about 3 million years after the earliest ichthyosaurs evolved. And that is many times faster than whales got to large size. So even though we often think about this big mammalian radiation, there certainly was, it still had a lot of sort of turnover to it, and it took a while. And many of these mammals that did very well at the very beginning are not around anymore. That you have these things called pantodonts or mesonychids or myacids, all these sorts of mammal, cretodonts is another great one. All these mammal groups that were doing kind of dog-like things, kind of cat-like things, kind of hippo-like things, but by the end of the Eocene, by around 40 million years ago or so, they're shuffling off the evolutionary stage, and we're starting to see now the evolution of more familiar animals. Some of the field work that Beth Townsend is doing out in the Uinta Basin deals directly with this, where you start to see like the earliest rabbits and cats and dogs and camels and things like that. So yeah, we're still, I think, learning quite a bit about like the why reasons, but a large part of it was that I think a lot of the adaptations and evolutionary responses that mammals kind of acquired or cultivated during the Mesozoic kind of served them well once the field was clear.
Excellent, thank you. So Jimena Diaz has probably my favorite comment at this moment. She says, Riley, I also wanted to tell you that my Chilean geologist colleagues recommended the book to me through our WhatsApp group. You are already internationally famous.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that. I keep hoping for more translations of the book. That makes me happy. Thank you.
That would be great. Jeff Alvari says, thank you. Enjoyable presentation. Didn't know about the IR radiation followed by acid rain. Not a good day.
No, not in the least. I think we can all relate to, what it's like having to kind of go into our own burrows for at least 2 or 3 years at this point. So that was part of writing this book, is that some of it, I didn't intend to write a book that would be relatable as it was, but I certainly found some parallels in the process.
For sure. Calvin Black says, I finished your book last week and it was so much fun and I learned a lot. What a clever format choice. I agree. It's a great format.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there wasn't a book quite like this. Raptor Red, I guess, kind of gets some of the book in the 90s that Robert Bacher wrote. But I wanted to do something that really was an update about this extinction and what we've come to understand about it, because I realized even my own work, I kind of yada yada the extinction, right? It's like big rock hits planet, yada yada yada, mass extinction. It's like, well, we know that that's not accurate. We know that there's more to it than that, and that story of recovery just hadn't been told. So yeah, this felt like a fun way to do it.
So Dan Mabbott, and this actually is a great question. My perennial question, why are so many Allosaurus found in the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry?
Yes. Well, I mean, this gets back at like, proximal and ultimate causes, right? We know that there's so many because now, thanks to the great work that Joseph Peterson and Patrick Warnock and their group are doing. They're actually going to be out in June, I think, and I hope to join them again, learn a little bit more out there. But we know something about the taphonomy, that you had all these Allosaurus that are dying out in the landscape when you'd have these sort of monsoonal kind of rainstorms that, these stream beds would become filled, all those dinosaur bones would get washed through them and kind of spill over into this pond that is now Cleveland Lloyd. Season after season, you'd have this kind of like gross dinosaur soup. So that's the kind of taphonomic reason. But why the species balance is so skewed, I don't know if we know that. I don't know if we can ever know that. My favorite hypothesis, based upon the idea that some of these bones seem to have medullary tissue, suggesting that some of the Allosaurus there were gravid females, or basically in the egg-laying stage, and that one of the first dinosaur eggs from Utah was described from the Cleveland Lloyd quarry. it really makes me wonder if there was something like a lek or a mating ground or some reproductive reason that these dinosaurs are gathering to nest in the area. And during some years it would be bad and a number of them would perish and eventually become buried in this one place. Because when you look at every other Morrison Formation quarry that's like this, whether it's the Mother's Day quarry or Hanksville Burpee or Dinosaur National Monuments or whatever it is, you have mostly sauropods, mostly diplodocids or Camarasaurus. You have the occasional Stegosaurus. It's mostly herbivorous animals. So to have a place that is primarily carnivores, primarily one species, that is weird. That is kind of unusual. And it makes me feel like, well, why do animals gather? And mating and nesting is certainly one of those reasons. So I'd really love if somewhere out there, I will certainly keep my eyes peeled for it when I'm out there next month. But I wonder if there is a nesting ground that we haven't yet found, or if there's some other clue about why Allosaurus are gathering in this place the way they do. So that's still very much an open question. And yeah, we may never know, but I certainly think it's awesome to think about, like, why is it so skewed in this one place? And what does that mean for Morrison Formation ecology?
Yeah, I used to think that maybe the reason those Allosaurs all got together was that, yeah, I used to think that maybe they would have been a pack hunter, which I know used to be a thing until I read about cannibalism within Allosaurus. So I think maybe it could be that they were all gathered by maybe one big sauropod carcass, because I did read something similar like that in D. Lomax's Locked in Time.
Yeah, that's certainly an idea that's come up before. I think it wouldn't be one event. It seems to be multiple events over multiple seasons that this is happening over and over again. But yeah, I don't know if we have great evidence for like sort of like pack hunting behavior, because there are also things that happen like even now where you'll have like Nile crocodiles that gather around a carcass. They're not working together. They're not social predators, but they're all trying to feed on this particular thing. Yeah, maybe that has something to do with it. But yeah, that's the wonderful thing about this, is that we don't yet know, and I hope that the answer is somewhere out there.
Yes, yeah. Usually, when it comes to feeding, social feeding, or any kind of social behavior with theropods, well, I do think crocodiles are a good comparison. I do think maybe another, if not better, good comparison to use as an analogy is for Komodo dragons, which they do hunt together. They do come together like crocodiles to bring down food, but they do fight over parts of the carcass, and adults are known to cannibalize juveniles. So it's kind of had me wonder if maybe there could have been also a case of adult theropods cannibalizing juveniles, if the signs show.
Yeah, and that's something we can certainly look for, like in tooth marks and things like that. So yeah, there's some really great taphonomic papers on that. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about it.
So we had somebody, I don't know, Riley, if you knew this, but we had somebody who's joining us from Japan, and his name is Joseph Hart, and he very nicely put in Japanese, I would assume, characters. And I did a quick Google translation, and I think it says, "Thank you for your wonderful presentation."
Yes.
Am I right, Joseph? Are you still there with us? You can unmute. Yeah. Hi. Did I get it right?
Yes, you did.
Okay, cool. So Google Translate works on those beautiful characters.
Yes. Arigato, Joseph. Thank you very much for that.
And then Anita says, "Thank you for including folks from the Minnesota Geological Society." I would assume that's somewhere in your notes.
I'm not sure. I think it might have been some of the folks that just joined us tonight, saying like thank you for including them. But yeah,
it's joining us.
It's great to have folks from all over.
Yeah, and then Matt Heff says, "Hi, Riley. Hope to see you in the field in July with Dr. Beth."
Yes, that would be so good. Beth's camp is one of the best ones that I've been in, and I know this year that we're planning on doing a lot of screen washing, Eocene stuff. So looking for tiny teeth and things like that. So yeah, definitely reach out to Beth Townsend if you're looking to do some fun Eocene field work.
So Robert Peterson says, thank you for the reminder. I need to finish Raptor Red. And he also translated Joseph's comments to thank you for the wonderful presentation. And let's see. Dan Mobbitt says, I knew it was controversial. I wanted your take on it. I'm not sure exactly. Dan, could you elucidate, please?
Elizabeth, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Riley. I have a granddaughter who also is called Riley, and she's going to be 16 tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday to her.
Yeah.
All right. And Elaine Jones says, on a personal note, you're looking great, woman. I love the hair. And you said thank you back. And Perry Levitt says, great presentation. Thank you. BJ says, thank you so much, Riley. Lori's reading your book now, and I will soon. Love from us and Mackerel Boys. You acknowledged. And Daniel Montague Judge says, thank you, Riley. Great work. Okay. Made it through the chat stuff. Please feel free to unmute and just ask questions.
Yeah. Going back to when you were talking about mammals and brains, you said that when mammals started getting big, their brains didn't get big along with the body size. Any theories that you know about that?
Sorry, I missed the last half of your question. You're saying, what do I know anything else about that?
Any theories that you know behind that, or any of your own?
Oh, well, I'm going to drop the link to that particular story in the chat, so that might give you some more information. It seems that just that's the way that evolution played out. Brain size and body size. Like, if you think of a body as like all these different components, as you get bigger, not everything is going to get bigger in the same way or at the same time. So this was something that seemed that body size, for whatever reason, seemed to be much more important, or a way in which mammals were beginning to change. We also know that this was a time period when vegetation was changing. We have first legumes, the first beans, the first these high energy, very protein rich plants that are very important for growth. And that seemed to just precede these changes in brain size, because for brains to change, you need to have different forms of behavior. Brains are also very energetically expensive. So there needs to be a food source for them to get larger. This has to do with our own evolution as well. We see this between, for example, Australopithecines and the earliest members of our own genus, that there's this encephalization that happens, that the brains tend to get a little bit bigger and they tend to get a little bit more reorganized. And that had to do with basically accessing more protein and fats and things that brains need. So we don't entirely know why sort of body size came before brain size, but it seems to have something to do with the interactions that these mammals were having, that when you have these environments where it's kind of wide open, that you're able to have a lot of generalists survive that can eat insects and also eat some plants and also eat some carrion. They're not really specializing in anything yet. And it's as mammals became more specialized to particular niches that, like, I'm going to live in a tree and I'm just going to eat insects, or I'm going to be primarily a carnivore and just eat meat. And then we start to see those social interactions, interspecies interactions, start to have a greater effect on the brain.
Oh, so I'm guessing also maybe diet it sounds like from how you explained that maybe diet might also have an effect on the brain, from how it's from the way you put it, some mammals may have become omnivorous rather than strictly herbivorous or carnivorous.
Yeah, it seems that many of the mammals that survived into the Paleocene were more generalized, that they're able to eat lots of different kinds of food, and specialization came from what we call niche partitioning. So you have all these animals, all these organisms living in the same habitat. And in order to live in that same habitat over time, they start doing different things and start specializing on different diets or different behaviors. And you'll see that in places like Madagascar is a great example, that you'll go into a particular patch of forest and there's certain lemurs that only eat bamboo, and then certain lemurs that only eat this other particular kind of plant. And it allows them to coexist in the same place, because rather than competing for the same food source, they split it out into these different specialties. So it's that sort of thing that it takes another 10 million years or so after impact to really start kicking up.
Oh.
All right. So then we also have Mariana Shelton saying thanks for an interesting presentation, and to UFOP for inviting other clubs to join in. And I do want to say to anyone, you know, you're always welcome as long as we do this online, everybody, anywhere, anytime. So it's great, and we love having you from all the places. Elaine says she has to jump. Great presentation. She's ordered the book and looking forward to reading it. Michael Grenier is saying, in from Rochester, New York, Academy of Science, but also an occasional UFOP member. Excellent. Thank you, Michael. Ordered book tonight. Loved my beloved Brontosaurus. That was good.
Yeah, I need to rewrite that one. There's so many things that have changed since then. Well, some of you know my girlfriend Splash, and Allosaurus is her favorite. So I've always thought about doing kind of a redo and calling it My Adored Allosaurus and revisiting some of these places.
That's funny. Ellen.
Oh,
Robert Peterson says, I believe Dan, that was a different discussion. And yeah, Robert, go ahead.
oh, so speaking of that Brontosaurus, so I think I've come across a couple times. Is that one? In that one, do you go over how the story of Brontosaurus, including the recent? Well, I wouldn't say it's recent. It was in 2015 that Brontosaurus just started to rise again. Is that what your Brontosaurus book goes over?
So the book came out in 2013, so it was about 2 years before that paper by Emmanuel Schopp and colleagues about the various sauropods came out. But it does go into the story of Brontosaurus and why we kind of, the back and forth about that name, how we used it, but also didn't use it and kind of left it, but might be back in play again. So it certainly could use an update in that respect, but at least in terms of the history, sort of like how this name got established and all the back and forth over it that exists and how we settled, at least for a time, on Apatosaurus. Yes, that's certainly part of the book, because I wanted to use that as an example of the science of paleontology, how science works. That this is not something where we find a bone, we give it a name, we just put it on a shelf, and that's it. That this is a conversation that's always going on, a big back and forth that's constantly happening. And what we know today is even likely to change tomorrow. So yeah, that's certainly part of that book.
And when you were writing this book, did you have any opinion on whether it is Apatosaurus or if it should be brought back?
Okay.
Yeah, I still don't think that Brontosaurus is. I love the name, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But even in the new study, Brontosaurus comes out as the sister species to the two other Apatosaurus species. So they form a clade together. They form a group to the exclusion of other related dinosaurs like Barosaurus and Diplodocus. So we can call it Brontosaurus if we want to. Some people have a view that like every dinosaur species should be monogeneric, basically that you have one genus name and one species, or under every genus you only have one species. I don't particularly take that because that's not how we organize the rest of biology, and there are all different philosophies about this. So to me, there's still a strong case to call it Apatosaurus. It's still the closest dinosaur to the other Apatosaurus species that we know about. But if somebody wants to call it Brontosaurus, like I'm not going to get nitpicky and tell them no, it is a separate species. It is a super cool name. And I like that we also have Brontomeris, which is another one of our Utah dinosaurs. It means thunder thighs, which is, that one seems relatively stable. And it's another sauropod dinosaur. So I'm glad we at least have these great names in discussion, even if some of them are still controversial.
Yes, I would agree too, and I will. I do say that I do grow up with both Apato and Bronto, and I will say, Bronto does have a more fitting name. Does have a more name fitting meaning, but at the same time, when I read the study 2015, it said that I think there was just a few differences they found, in which, to me, that's satisfying. But at the same time, you know, it could still be the same, because I mean, one could be wiped out any day, anytime soon. But I still look at both sides of the subject, and I don't really take sides anymore.
Yeah, and I agree with your comment in the chat, Robert, that, yeah, did you want to read it, Jean?
Yeah, okay. Paleontology in general seems like a great way to talk about the scientific method, since it hits this perfect middle of the Venn diagram of a field of science that's rapidly changing and people still care a whole lot about it. I like this comment.
Yeah, I agree entirely. It really is a wonderful science. The curiosity of it is what, you know, really brings me in, because we want to know. You know, you find a bone out in the field, or you see a skeleton in the museum, or, you know, a trackway, and you wonder what was this organism? How long ago did it live? And what was its environment like? And what should it sound like? All these things that maybe we don't have the answers to all of these questions, but by asking them, it makes us think. It makes us think about, how do we test this? How do we compare it to things around us? It's a really synthetic form of science in that it requires input from all these different disciplines, and it requires us to say, like, hey, this is like where I see it from. Like, you know, this is sort of my background and my expertise. And when I look at this is what I see. Do you see the same thing? And it's really wonderful how much the field has changed. You know, there's certain things that we certainly know, but it's basically a conversation with nature, that, you know, there is a natural reality that exists and that we want to understand better, but our ideas about it, our theories about that interaction between fact and hypothesis and theory, it's always changing. And like you said, Robert, I think paleontology is a great intersection of all of this.